Hi everyone, my name is DVJ. Based on the question given, I will complete the legal capacity required in making a will and declaring a trust in Malaysia with the justification of these decisions. Before that, do you know what is a will? Section 2 Sub 1 of the Wills Act defines a will in Peninsular Malaysia and Sarawak as a legal declaration made by a testator or testatrix concerning their property or other matters, intended to ensure that their wishes are enforceable after his or her death, including a testament, a codicil, or a written designation to exercise power in the form of a will or similar will, and a will or testament of the guardianship, custody, and tuition of any child. In Sabah, Section 2 of the Wills Ordinance defines a will as a legal declarations made by the testator or testatrix regarding their property that aim to ensure that execution of their wishes after their death, including testament, written designation for exercising power in the form of wills and similar wills. However, Section 2 Sub 2 of the Wills Act and Section 1 Sub 2 of the Wills Ordinance state that this act does not apply to the wills of Muslims, include the person who practices Islam. Wills, testamentary rights are not affected by any provision of these acts, and the Muslim who making a will is governed by Islamic inheritance law of Farid. For the legal capacity required in making a will, the testator or testatrix must have the testamentary capacity. Section 3 of the Wills Act states that they must be of sound mind when making a will, and they of unsound mind cannot make a will. Under Section 2 of the Probate and Administrations Act, they of unsound mind included any person of unsound mind incapable of managing themselves or their affairs. Section 3 of the Civil Law Act enabled Malaysian court to apply English common law and rules of equity. Testamentary capacity is always a question of fact, depends on circumstances of each cases. In lay aguilera, if the testator or testatrix was unsound mind before making the will, they must prove to the court that they have recovered their mental capacity in a timely manner, or they made the will when they were of lucid interval. The Benz and Goodfellow case established the test of testamentary capacity. When making the will, they must understand the nature and effect of the will. They must understand the scope of the property to be distributed. They must understand the claims of potential beneficiaries. And last, they must not suffer from a mental disorder or instant delusions that affect their distribution of the will property. So, if the testator or testatrix have a delusion in making a will, they are deemed to lack of the testamentary capacity. Dew and Clark defines the delusion as a belief that a rational person cannot hold, namely the existence of something that cannot be eradicated from the testator or testatrix mind through rational argumentations. For example, the testatrix in Costi and Charling deluses herself into believing there is an international conspiracy by dark forces plotting to flank herself. So any testator or testatrix have not able to making a will if they have the delusion to believe a mistake fact at the time. In lay Tom Pugh, if they suffer several memory loss due to illnesses, causing them to overlook the inheritance rights of their relative and trust, affecting the distribution of the will, then they cannot make a will. So, after conditions like irrationality are not the conclusive evidence of the testator or testatrix, have not the legal capacity in making a will due to the lack of testamentary capacity. So, as the judge Knife Bruce say in Bird and Lucky, no man is proud to make a will in such a manner as to deserve approbation from the prudent, the wise, or the good. So, a testator is permitted to be careless and improvident, and is moreover at liberty to conquer the circumstances and the motives by which his has been assured in his disposition. Therefore, they are no bound to have good or any reason for what they do in making a will. So it's like the irrational or morally questionable dispositions do not automatically prove lack of the testamentary capacity. Also, there is no legal presumption that an Al-Hawkoni lays testamentary capacity. However, Elliot and Hill stated if the testator or testatrix was under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time of its creation, thereby impairing their capacity, such as by making the testator or testatrix unable to understand the nature of the act of will. Then they have not able to make a will. Not only that, but the testator or testatrix who are old age and infirmity does not automatically lose the ability to make a will due to testamentary incapacity. However, in 2025, the Court of Appeal in Kong Hin Lei and Kong Hin Xiong stated, advanced age, senility, illness, and suspicious circumstances surrounding the execution of the will may seriously undermine their testamentary capacity, and the promoter of the will bears a burden of proving that they have the necessary mental capacity at the time of making a will. The testator or testatrix should have exercised their generally free choice in making the will with a true intention. In Ong Chen Guan and Ong Heng Ho, they have not able to make the will if there's any one of the extraneous violating elements in making the will, such as coercion, fraud, mistake, or undue influence. Making the will also requires the informed intention by them. The test is whether they seem a document that appears to be a will with intending to make the property effective after their death, or to do any other methods that can be done by the will. If the answer is yes, then they may have the legal capacity to make a will, as it can be presumed that there is an intention to make a will if the document appears to be a will. However, Lister and Smith stated if the document is actually the result of a contrivance to affect some collateral object to assume some secondary purpose, and they were never intended to be disposed of as property, then it will be unreasonable for the court to judge that they have able to make a will. Second, the testator or testatrix must be of the majority age when making the will. Under Section 4 of the Wills Act, the will made by minors are invalid. Since the Wills Act had not identified who are the minors, Section 2 of the Match of Majority Age stated the minor status of all persons in Malaysia terminates when they reach the age of 18. Therefore, the testator or testatrix who are 18 years old or above has the legal capacity to make a will. On the other hand, the definition of trust is different in the perspective of Muslim and non-Muslim. In civil law, a trust is an estate planning tool established during the lifetime of the property owner. It can take effect immediately upon establishment or after the owner's death. The trust is established by a seller who decrees a trust and transfer ownership of the subject property to a trustee. Unlike Islamic trust law, a trust is based on the concept of amanah and must comply with the Sharia principles. But the Court of Appeal in T.M. Philoskram and Manor Hussein case stated the applicable law in Malaysia concerning trust matters is civil law, regardless of whether the parties is Muslim or non-Muslim. So until now, Malaysia has not clearly provided any legal capacity for the sellers to decree the trust during lifetime. Therefore, the courts can adopt the English equitable principle. So, for the legal capacity required in declaring a trust, the seller must have the mental capacity. So, in the general rule, the seller who are not mentally incapable can decree the trust. In Chow Yi Wa and True Up Part, the mental state of the seller is important in the declaration of trust. A mentally incapacitated person can dispose of trust property, but only during their periods of sound mind. In Goodman and Gallants, the declaration of trust was conclusive in the essence of the fraud or mistake. So the seller who cannot be able to decree the trust through the violating factors. Not only that, but the seller can also use the remedies to maintain their declaration of trust when they are unsound mind. Part 10 of the Mental Health Act stated a High Court may appoint a committee to help manage the declaration of trust by the seller with mental disorders. Any trust decreed by the seller with a mental disorder after the committee's establishment is invalid. But the trust decreed by the seller before the committee's establishment, they were of sound mind is valid. Another is a labeling test, which used to measure whether the seller possesses the mental capacity to give a gift in the trust during their lifetime. They need to able understand the nature, manner, and consequences of the gift. The mental capacity required of a lifetime gift provided by the seller depends on the silliness and impact of the gift. If the gift disposes of the seller's primarily or only the valuable assets and it's well effectively determine the distribution of the estate. The seller must possess a similar level of understanding as when making the will, including follow the bends and good fellow tastes. Second, the seller must understand the minor capacity when they are minor in declaring the trust. The minor capacity to declare the trust depends on the nature of property in void. Any property trust of immovable property by the seller when they are minor is void. For example, the minor cannot own a land which state in section 43 sub A of the National Land Court. However, the seller who is minor can own movable property and they have able to declare the trust. However, the trust can be referred by the minor unless the trust is still binding as they have not referred the trust when they are leasing the age of majority or within a reasonable time after reaching the age of majority. Section 2 of the Majority Act, which I mentioned earlier, is the minor should be the person who have not reached the age of 18. Now, there are several differences and similarities in the legal capacity required to make the will and declare the trust. First, the legal capacity required in declaring a trust is generally more stringent than making the will. The bends and good fellow taste already provide the standard for testamentary capacity when making the will. However, when declaring the trust, the seller usually transfer legal ownership or beneficial interest in the property immediately during their lifetime. Therefore, the seller is generally required to possess a higher degree of understanding and judgment regarding the legal consequences of the transaction. Second, the judge determine the testatory or seller's legal capacity which based on the legal framework is different. The legal framework governing wills in Malaysia is clearer and more comprehensive than the legal framework governing trust. But Malaysia does not provide a comprehensive statutory framework specifically governing the legal capacity of sellers in declaring the trust. Therefore, the courts often rely on English equitable principles like libenitas and the remedies in the Mendes Health Act. Third, the minor generally cannot make a will, but they can declare the trust involving movable property only. Nevertheless, both wills and trusts similarly require the testator or the testatree or the seller to possess sufficient mental capacity and not by the fighting factors to understand the nature and consequences of the will and the trust. The decisions in the requirement level is reasonable because at the time of making the trust, any mistake, incapacity, or undue influence can immediately deprive the seller of ownership or control of the property during their lifetime. In contrast, the will do not immediately change property ownership and can be referred or modified during the testator's lifetime. Therefore, in trust, a stringent examination of the seller's mental capacity and free will is necessary to maintain the authenticity and autonomy of the seller's wishes, and the autonomy requires that decisions truly reflect their values, intentions, and rational judgment. However, the decisions regarding the judge determine the legal capacity by using different legal framework is not reasonable. The legal capacity of a will is clearly defined by the Wills Act and is supported by established common law principles like the Benz test. In contrast, Malaysia currently lays a comprehensive statutory framework regulating the legal capacity of sellers in declaring the trust. Without the statute, this can be creating the uncertainty and inconsistency in the judgment as determining the applicable standard of legal capacity for the sellers. Next, the decisions for the minor capacity is reasonable because the will disposes of property permanently after the testator's death. So the law strictly requires the testator or testatree to be a full adult. In contrast, the trust involving movable property can operate for the lifetime of a minor and sometimes even be deferred after the seller releases adulthood. Trust equity law takes a more flexible approach. Finally, requiring both the testator or testatrix and the sellers to be of sound mind without the violating factors is reasonable, as both will and trust inflict important decisions regarding the distribution of property and legal consequences. Therefore, the Malaysian law must ensure that they truly understand the nature and effect of the legal transaction to protect individual autonomy and prevent abuse of power. That's all. Thank you.